On this episode of The Word Made Fresh, we are talking about the first preacher. Hey everyone, I'm Reverend Jim Keat, digital minister at the Riverside Church, and this is The Word Made Fresh, the weekly video Bible study sermon prep resource where we talk about an upcoming lectionary text or something like that, and then, talk, comment, share. You know the drill. Now, this is the basement of my apartment that I'm in now, and I'm using this kind of as a workspace. I call it my studio, so...
Hello.
So I thought I would just film a little video here for you because I was working in my studio. And also because this week's episode is going to be a little different. I'll get to that in a second. Okay, first, this coming Sunday, you probably know this, it's Easter. We are officially in Holy Week. If you're watching this in real time at least, it comes out on Monday, April 6th, 2020. Easter is coming up this coming Sunday. Now, this is a story you probably know. Spoiler alert, Jesus comes back.
I'll be back.
But I want to focus on one specific aspect. In the story, you see the Easter story, you've read it before. It's in all four of the Gospels. Although Mark's has an interesting earlier version that we typically skip over. And that's another story. So in these Gospel stories of Jesus' resurrection, it goes something like this. The disciples, aka the men, are in this home together, which is not a good physical distancing practice. Come on, people, Zoom to talk with each other. Don't get in the same house right now. And then who goes to the tomb on Sunday morning to tend to the burial rituals? The women. One of those women was Mary Magdalene. Now, when Mary and the other women get to the tomb, they find it empty. That's the spoiler alert I told you about. Sorry if I just ruined the story. And then they go back to tell the disciples what has happened. Mary Magdalene, however, has this moment where she sees Jesus. She mistakes him for a gardener. This is specifically found in John's Gospel, the version I'm thinking of. And there's this whole what have you done with him? Mary, it's I. Ah! And then she goes back to the disciples. Jesus actually tells her, go to the disciples and tell them this. So she goes and she says to them, I have seen the Lord. Now, let's pause for a couple minutes on this. The word apostle means someone who is sent. So we think of the apostles as the people who Jesus sent out to, spread the good news. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. The apostles are the ones who are sent by Jesus to proclaim this good news. And technically speaking, Mary is the first of those. She is told by Jesus in John 20, go tell them. And so when she goes to the disciples, she preaches the first sermon of the resurrection. I have seen the Lord. 5 words, a 5-word sermon was the first proclamation of the resurrection. That's the first sermon, if you're counting sermons as, the proclamation of resurrection of Jesus and new life and hope and goodness and all that good stuff. The first preacher was a woman. So that makes me think, all the churches and spaces where women are still kind of kept out of certain aspects of ministry and leadership in life, specifically the pulpit. Well, back when this whole thing got rolling, the first preacher was a woman, which makes me think maybe the most fitting Easter sermon should always come from a woman, just to kind of honor that heritage and to reclaim that history into our present. Okay, anyway, so that's just the context I wanted to give you, which is also kind of interesting. But this episode of The Word Made Fresh is going to be different because now we're going to transition from watching me talk to a little audio experience. About 5 years ago, I started a project called The First Preacher, where it was going to focus on exploring the ministry and the stories and the lives of women who do this amazing work in our world today. And I kind of got it started, but then I didn't go anywhere with it because, I don't know, life happened or something. And I recorded one interview, and I've never used it in anything, and so I figured this would be a good day to release it. So, for the next, I haven't finished editing the audio yet. For the next little bit, this many minutes, you're going to get to hear a conversation between myself and Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber, where we talk about her experience and life as a preacher and what does it mean to be a woman in ministry. So yeah, you can kind of just enjoy a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, preferred beverage, and listen to this conversation. And then we'll maybe be back for a quick little button at the end to say hey and go from there. So, okay, here's Nadia. Ready? Okay.
My name is Nadia Bolz-Weber, and I am the founding pastor of House for All Sinners and Saints, which is a Lutheran church in Denver.
So if someone says to you, Nadia, what's a sermon? What do you say to them?
It's ear-stuffable Jesus.
Ear-stuffable Jesus?
Yeah, yes. Like,
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
like it's putting the word of God into the ears of people, of sinners. Like this is what a sermon is. Like a sermon should in my view, a sermon should always both convict us, but should convict us in order to free us. Meaning, I'm what's called a law and gospel preacher, which is a very sort of orthodox Lutheran view of preaching, where you have to, it's so hard to understand why the good news is good if we're not clear why the bad news is bad. And so there's something within each text you're going to preach on that can convict you, that can sort of show you the way in which there's no way to fulfill the law on your own. But in order to point to the work of Christ, to say it actually is fulfilled, like here's who you are in Christ, here's what God has done for you, rather than, because what I think passes for preaching, honestly, in most contexts, liberal and conservative, is some version of here's the problem and here's what you should be doing about it. I've never heard that as good news my entire life, ever.
Okay, so you preached a lot of sermons and probably heard a few. Tell me about the first sermon you remember encountering.
I honestly don't remember particular sermons growing up, except for one, because a teenage boy got to preach it. And he was so proud, and everyone was rooting for him. And I remember thinking, none of the teenage girls will ever get to have this experience, he just was so proud and nervous, and it was lovely, to see people rooting for him, wanting him to preach well. And I remember him saying, church isn't like a gas station where you just come to get filled up. I remember he used that illustration. I don't know why, it just stuck with me. I remember it as a conglomerate, what was basically usually said. And I've written very snarky versions of this, so I don't need to repeat them here.
Okay, what about your first sermon? What's the story of the first sermon you remember?
And I preached about, I think, there was something about burning the chaff away, one of those texts. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, we aren't good determiners of chaff, right? We're not really the best judges of what is chaff and what is wheat, because I have some things I'm pretty proud of that I think that's got to be wheat, Lord, that has got to be wheat, and God's wrong, burn, right? Or stuff that I'm there's no way you can do anything with this, you've got to burn this away, this is chaff, and God's what? No, man, that's totally useful. So I feel and I think that was the point I made in that first sermon. Yeah.
How long ago was this?
That would have been in 2006.
Well, tell me about a time when you preached a sermon and you finished it and thought, I could do this for the rest of my life.
I feel that to tell you the truth, almost every week that I preach. Now, I feel like a complete wreck up until I preach it. So,
really?
Yeah, no, I'm a completely faithless preacher. Because every week, I'm not kidding, every week, I look at the text and I think, well, I've had a pretty good run, but it's clearly over now. I will never find anything to say about this text. I do. I just think I should just, that's why I always have 10 minutes of Lectio Divina in my back pocket, just in case. And I think it's not happening and it's not going to work, and I still kind of commit to the process anyway, but I think it's still not going to happen. And I almost always think, sometime on Sunday, we meet Sunday at 5. Sometime on Sunday, I think, I should really apologize to the church before I preach this one. Like, they deserve so much better. And or I'll have the thought, they're just going to be kind of embarrassed for me when they hear this, right? Because it's not that good. I'm not kidding. Like, almost every week, I am not an overly confident preacher. However, as soon as I'm preaching it, all of that's gone. Then it's the word. Then I'm carried. And so I never feel that when I'm preaching it, and I never feel it after. But up until that point, I'm pretty sure it's a piece of shit. And so no, I don't ever sort of regret them or feel like, oh, that was terrible. And afterwards, I think, oh wow, man, it happened again. Like, the word was preached. And it was preached by me.
Stuffed
like, that's
Jesus
just, I just like stuffed Jesus in these people's ears.
Tell me about the process for a sermon for you.
Well,
aside from the utter
the horrible
nerves.
faithlessness and despair and anxiety. Okay, so other than that part, I take, I look at it usually on Tuesday, and then I become completely overtaken by it. Like, it whatever text it is I'm preaching on, it just undoes me throughout the week. And I can't tell you how many times the text happens to me. So, like, if the text is about forgiveness, I have the opportunity to forgive someone, or someone else forgives me. Or it's very odd how many times, it's uncanny.
You avoid the text about, like, giving away all your possessions?
Yeah, man. I'm like, no, I want to keep my jeans. But the text happens to me on some level. And so this obsession that I have, I think about it when I'm walking my dog, and I think about it like in the shower. After I'm done having coffee with someone from my parish, I'll say, hey, can we read the text together and tell me what you hear? I call my friends who are preachers and talk to them about it. I even have my brain trained, this sounds weird, but like in the middle of the night, if I wake up in the middle of the night, I have my brain trained, instead of to think of what's going on the next day, I literally run through the text. It's like, I describe it as having like a not very interesting mental illness.
But quite advantageous for a preacher, I suppose.
So I just think about it all the time, and then I usually try to preach something nice, or try to preach something obvious, or try to preach something I've already whatever, and that doesn't work until a lot of times there's something in the text I'm avoiding throughout the week because it's too uncomfortable, or it makes me face something I don't want to look at. And then so I'll try and write another sermon, and I'll twist and pull it and like wrestle with it, and then and it's not until I completely give up and start over that it actually flows. So a lot of times if I'm fighting that hard, I have to give up and then just start over.
Yeah.
Like admit defeat, and then somehow in that process of admitting defeat, the word's allowed to actually come. But like getting the ego out of the way, or the sense of self, of self-importance, of low self-esteem, whatever, all that stuff gets in the way. But I always dig because I want it to be good news for me, right?
Yeah.
Because so I have to look at, like, what's the part I don't want to look at in this text? What's the part of me that it's exposing? And then once I'm able to really get honest about that, I can then preach what the good news is in the text for me, right? Like my parishioners have said many times that they're glad that they have a preacher who's clearly preaching to herself and allowing them to overhear it.
So who influences the sermons you write, or the way in which they come out? Whose voices are you echoing when you're putting a sermon together?
Well, I'm not as big of a reader as I could be. Reading's hard for me, actually. I don't have like great reading comprehension. It's not how my brain takes things in. So I always joke that I don't read, but I just have a lot of conversations with people who do a lot of reading. So it has to do with who I'm in conversation with. There's a writer right now I'm in conversation with a lot, Joshua Schenk, and he writes nonfiction, and not Christian at all, and but just an interesting thinker, and like a really he feels things in the world very deeply, and I've been enjoying having conversations with him. When I listen to Tiny Beautiful Things, Cheryl Strayed's reading, like I listened to the audiobook of her reading those Dear Sugar letters that really influenced my preaching that week. And then, it was I learned more about pastoral care listening to her read those letters than I ever did in seminary. When I read Unapologetic, my sermon the next week was really influenced by it. So when I'm able to read or listen to stuff or have conversations, that's what's in the mix that week. It just varies. Yeah.
Any pre-sermon rituals?
Anytime I preach, whether it's in a huge church where you walk way up into this high pulpit, or whether it's a music stand in the middle of people at house, I imagine stepping under a mantle. I do. I have this image of, and wearing the stole helps, because that's a symbol for it. But I do have this image of when I step into that space, I'm stepping under a mantle of preacher. I am now holding the office of preacher, and it matters to me to have that image.
It's huge.
Yeah, it's not me anymore, in a sense, right?
Yeah. It's not the Nadia show.
No, and it's interesting if you listen to my sermons, I tone my personality way the down usually in my sermons, right? Like when I'm a speaker, my personality's kind of big, but in my church, it's very low key because it's not about me as a personality or as a charismatic figure at all. It can't be. And so I'm very low key about the way I preach. Very intentionally.
When was a time that you first realized that some people have a problem with women in ministry?
Well, I was raised in a church. I went to a church 3 times a week my entire life where women literally couldn't pray out loud in front of men. So
you have a chapter in pastoring.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for me, I think the question is better. A better question would be, when did I first realize women could be pastors?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until my late 20s. And I think the first time I saw it was in Eugene, Oregon. We went to this one church for worship, and there was a woman pastor. And I knew that ELCA ordained women, but to be in a service where a woman was leading, that was like profound. There's a young family at our church. They have a young daughter, and they came out of very conservative Christianity, where women aren't pastors, and you never would ever use a female pronoun to refer to God. And last Sunday in Reagan's sermon, he used a female pronoun to refer to God, as both of us occasionally do. And then there was that. And then during communion, this little kid cut in line, which is my favorite thing. When toddlers cut in line at communion, I'm like, you are such a badass. I love you. And I totally gave this kid the thumbs up. And her mom picked her up. And after the liturgy, this mom, they've only been around for 2 months. She came up to me and she goes, "Can I hug you?" And I say, "Yeah." She gives me a hug. She goes, "I'm so glad our daughter's going to grow up in this congregation.
Yeah.
You have no idea." So it's meaningful to see different types of people being embodied leaders in the church, because that's always going to image the divine on some level for us. That's just how we're wired. So to say this person is speaking these holy things, and they're also in a wheelchair, or they're also, speak with an accent because English isn't their first language, or they also have a same-sex partnership, whatever it is. We need manifestations of all of humanity speaking these words and taking on this leadership so that we can all see ourselves through the eyes of God. That stuff matters. It just does. I believe this is one way that God moves through the world, because I've seen it over and over again. I think that when there's something we did not have that we perceived that we probably needed, I've seen God use that to create that thing for someone else. Meaning, I didn't have it, but my work has been creating it for other people, for other children. So the way my 2 of my parishioners, Jim and Stuart, staff an event in Denver, sometimes they'll volunteer at it, which is called Queer Prom, right? So they want to be chaperones at Queer Prom. You know why? Nobody held a queer prom when they were growing up. You know what I mean? They didn't have that nurture and support. And so I've seen God use that in people to then create that thing for others. And that's healing and reconciliation and redemption. That's how some of that kind of stuff plays itself out.
Yeah. You've got a tattoo of Mary, the first preacher, I think somewhere on your arm, right?
Yeah.
What does that tattoo mean to you?
Well, oh my gosh. It was like this revelation when I realized that here's this woman who was deeply flawed. I mean, she was delivered of demons, so she had some kind of past, right? And she was so grateful for this healing and this wholeness that she received in the presence of Jesus that she just provided for his ministry. And like all the dudes cut out, right? Like they hightailed it out when stuff got hot, and she stuck with him. And she was at the cross. She came to the tomb, and like the fact that she was the one who was chosen to be the first witness of the resurrection. She was the one who was chosen to witness the resurrected Christ and to go and tell others. And when I realized that, when reading the text again as an adult, I was like, why didn't I ever hear that as a kid? I never heard that. And like when I was asked to speak at the ELCA National Youth Gathering a few years ago in New Orleans, it's like 30,000 teenagers. And there was a grassroots effort to get me and this other pastor, Andrea Ingram, who's an African-American HIV positive pastor in the Philly area, to get us uninvited because they thought we do not want our teenagers exposed to dangerous ideas from scandalous women. And I'm like, if nobody was ever exposed to dangerous ideas from scandalous women, Christianity would literally not exist.
We would have nothing.
We would have nothing.
We would have had a group of, cowardly men hiding in a room thinking, oh shit, Jesus died.
We were wrong. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are there are so many voices out there, and we're just only beginning to discover them and make room for them. And that is what bodes well for the church.
All right. Well, anything else that you want to say or I should hear that's come up in your mind as we've talked?
Just preach the damn gospel, Don't be tempted to preach an ideology or what's popular or whatever. Like, preach the gospel. Figure out what's going to free slaves and captives, and like bring good news to the poor. Like, everybody, you have to know the sin of the people you're speaking to if you're ever going to really preach the gospel to them. So that's why I'm not interested in having a big church, because I couldn't know that many stories. I couldn't be a preacher anymore.
Wow. You can't stuff Jesus in all their ears.
No, man, because I don't know what the recipe is for them, Anyway, thanks for the chat.
Yeah.
Welcome back. I think I forgot how to solve a Rubik's Cube. I got this part, and I got these parts, but I'm struggling with the top portion. All right, I need to think about this one again. Okay, so what'd you think of the conversation? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on preaching. If you're a preacher, how do you write a sermon? What's your experience with sermons been? And all of us, I just think it'd be cool. What's the first sermon you remember hearing? And what's your thoughts on women preaching, and why do we need more of it? Obviously I'm a little biased. I think women should be allowed to preach. I think anyone who God calls should be able to answer that call and do works and proclaim the good news of love and justice by any media necessary, whether that's a brick and mortar pulpit or, that was my podcast voice. So next week we'll be back. We're into the season after Easter, so get ready for some pre-Pentecost conversations, and then watch out because Pentecost is coming. When is Pentecost Sunday?
Pentecost is on Sunday, May 31st, 2020.
There you go, May 31st coming up. So we got a little while, I guess. April, May. Okay. I'll see you then. Bye. Back to the Rubik's Cube for me.